Brothers and sisters, welcome to our November session of Into the Deep, a series of lectures for seeking disciples. My name is Sister Angela Marie Castellani. I'm a Franciscan Sister of the Eucharist, and I serve as the coordinator for adult faith formation and catechesis. And with me tonight, working behind the scenes, is Luisa Gietz, who recently joined our Ministries and Outreach office. After a most enlightening talk at the beginning of the Lenten season earlier this year, we are delighted tonight to welcome back with us Dr. Michael Higgins. Tonight, Dr. Higgins will share with us about one of the most influential Catholic spiritual writers of the last century, Thomas Merton. And he will provide us with a couple of key ideas on our Advent journey, drawing on Thomas Merton's writing experiences and mystical insights. A little bit about Dr. Higgins. He's a native of Toronto, an author, scholar, Vatican Affairs Specialist for the Globe and Mail, Papal Commentator for the CTV Network, educator, CBC Radio documentarian, columnist, and former senior academic administrator. He has served as president and vice-chancellor of St. Jerome's University in Ontario, St. Thomas University, New Brunswick, and as the vice president for mission and Catholic identity at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. He was named Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Catholic Thought in the fall of 2020, and he's a recipient of many awards, including 2 honorary doctorates. Dr. Higgins has edited and co-authored and authored scores of books. He is a regular contributor of Commonwealth, New York, the Literary Review of Canada, the Tablet, London, and has been a columnist over the years for many Canadian newspapers and journalists. He is currently principal and president, respectively, of St. Mark's College and Corpus Christi College at the University of British Columbia. And he's married to Christina, a liturgical musician and writer, and they have 4 children. So we're very excited to have Dr. Higgins with us tonight. I will begin in prayer and then introduce and welcome Dr. Higgins. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. My Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end. Nor do I really know myself, and the fact that I think I'm following your will does not mean that I'm actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have the desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore will I trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And obviously this was a prayer written by Thomas Merton, and we will hear much more tonight about this wonderful Catholic scholar. And Dr. Higgins, welcome to Into the Deep tonight.
All righty. Thank you, Sister Angela Marie, and it's a pleasure to be back again with the community. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about Thomas Merton. And before we get to some passages about contemplation and meditation, let me tell you a little bit about him. Now, perhaps many of you out there have heard the name Thomas Merton. Some of you may be grand readers of his work. He has quite a number of disciples all over the world, both in the Catholic world and outside the Catholic world. His writings are extraordinary, and they are many. But I think what is helpful is to put him in context, give you a brief biographical profile, and then we can segue to reflecting on contemplation and freedom and recollection and prayer. Okay, that's the plan. Thomas Merton was born in 1915 in the midst of the Great War, and he was born in the Pyrenees in the south of France, on the French side, not the Spanish side, in a small little village called Prades. which is rather famous for, it's not Picasso, Pablo Casals, the famous cellist, is also from there. Merton's father was a New Zealander and a painter in the tradition of the great French landscape painter Cézanne. His mother was a Protestant. His father was a member of the Church of New Zealand, so basically an Anglican. His mother was, well, we've always had difficulty actually finding out what she is, partly Methodist, partly Quaker, anyway, a religious woman in her own way, and an American. As I say, Merton was born in 1915, and the family began almost from the beginning, introducing into his very DNA, if you like, his own genes, the fact that he would become a peripatetic. He would be wandering all the time. Even when he was in the monastery for 27 and a half years, pretty well concentrated in the monastery itself, he was still wandering in his mind and in his spirit. So he was always the pilgrim. In fact, the first book I ever wrote, I co-authored with an Anglican priest from Vancouver, Donald Grayston, who did his doctorate on Merton's New Seeds of Contemplation. And we worked together to create what was the first of what would become many international conferences on Thomas Merton. And the first one occurred at the University of British Columbia on the campus of the Vancouver School of Theology. So contemplation was extremely important to Merton, and Merton's life as a peripatetic monk was remarkable because it's a contradiction, right? If you're a monk, you take a vow of stability, stabilitas, you stay put. And Merton did physically stay put with a few forays out, once to Minnesota, once to New York to see the great Zen master Suzuki. And then, of course, eventually he went on his Asian trip, and he ended up being electrocuted accidentally in Bangkok, although there are theories that he was murdered. I don't subscribe to those conspiracy theories, but they're still afoot. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So what about Merton? So Merton was born, as I say, in France. His family is moving already. Well, it's the war, right? Eventually, they end up in back in the United States. His mother dies. She dies from stomach cancer, actually, and the psychiatrists now think it was unwise, but we, at the time, it would have been considered maternal and considerate, but now we would consider it an inappropriate practice. But his mother decided that she didn't want him to see anything ugly in his life. He was a child. And so he writes at one point very movingly about the fact that his mother wrote to him from the hospital telling him that she was dying. She wouldn't allow him to see it because death for her was ugly and she didn't want to traumatize him. Well, he spent a good deal of his life coming to grips with this reality, right? His father died 10 years later. So Merton also of cancer, this time metastasized in the brain. So Merton was kind of orphaned very early on. And that sense of being alone in the world was compounded by the tragic death of his one sibling, his brother, John Paul, who left the United States to come to Canada to join the Royal Canadian Air Force during the Second World War. And then on a flying expedition to Mannheim. On the return, he was shot down in the North Sea. His back was broken. He suffered for 3 hours, really. And then he died in this dinghy where some of the other members of the aircraft survived. And he was engaged to be married and had become a Roman Catholic and had come to see his brother in the monastery. Merton wrote one of his most beautiful and moving poems, an elegy on my brother reported missing in action in April 1943. A powerful poem. So by that time, Merton was completely the orphan, okay? So there's a lot of tragedy mixed with joy, pathos mixed with bliss, mystical illumination mixed with mystical darkness in his life. And this would become fodder that would feed his poetry and his prose and his extraordinary monastic witness. one of the great spiritual figures of the last century. I think inarguably the greatest Catholic spiritual figure of the 20th century. And he still has a huge influence on people. So let's go back. Merton is educated in France at the Lycée the Lycée Ingres in Montauban. And then he's educated at Ripley Court in England. He gets a scholarship. He goes off to Clare College, Cambridge. He behaves rather badly. He finds himself gated. His godfather virtually kicks him out of the country. He goes to the United States, enrolls at Columbia University in New York, and finishes his degree, does an MA, and begins work on his PhD. And somewhere in the course of that time in New York, he's converted to Catholicism. And he begins to discern whether he has a vocation. And at one point he thinks he does, and he goes off to St. Bonaventure University, which is a Franciscan university in northern New York State. And he tries his vocation there, but the father confessor who hears him is scandalized by the life that he led as a young man in Columbia. He was profligate and promiscuous, and he wasn't a saint. But then, of course, neither was St. Augustine and many other people. But anyway, this friar appears to have been a little taken with himself and overly self-righteous and scared Merton. Merton decided he didn't have a vocation. He couldn't possibly have. He goes back and he does some teaching in New York. But eventually a friend, a professor of philosophy, suggests to him that he goes to this monastery in Kentucky called Our Lady of Gethsemane. And off he goes. And he's smitten. And he eventually enters the monastery just a couple of days before, or just shy of, actually, the Pearl Harbor. So it's December of 1941. And Merton begins from then to the end of his life in 1968 to be not only the world's most famous Catholic monk, but its most prolific as well. Within a very short period of time, Merton begins to write, and his abbot encourages him to write. The abbot, when he was admitted, was a saintly man, but not terribly practical. The monastery was falling down. The roof was caving in. The monks were starving. They were frozen. They suffered from heat in the summer, and they froze in the winter. That's Kentucky weather for you. And but they knew they had a saintly abbot. And the abbot realized that Merton was different than the other novices, that if he didn't allow him to write, possibly he would go mad. And so he encouraged him to write. And so rather than stilling his pen, rather than burying his manuscripts, as some great romantics of the 19th century want to do at one point, Merton actually had reactivated to a marvelous degree the freedom to write as a poet, to write as a biographer or a hagiographer of Trappist saints, and to write about anything really, which is what he did, as we discovered with the numerous journals and diaries that have been published during his life and then published after his death. Merton is the only one whose productivity after he died was almost as great as when he was alive. Volumes and volumes of material still coming up with some of the small notebooks, so many years after his death. So Merton's in the monastery, and in the monastery, he begins to realize at one point, that contemplation isn't just for monks. Raimondo Panikkar, a great theologian of the church, particularly interreligious dialogue, one time a Spanish Jesuit with Indian parentage, he eventually left active ministry. He married, but he remained connected with the church, and he wrote marvelous books about ecumenical interfaith dialogue. But he wrote at one point about all of us, me, Sister Angela Marie, all of you out there in cyberspace, have a quintessential monkhood. There's part of you that is monkish. And he meant by that part of us which is drawn to the transcendent, drawn to those silent interior moments that dispose us to a deeper embrace with the Lord. And that component is extremely important in everyone's life. Now, we can ignore it, we can cultivate it, we can call it by different names, we can do many things, but it's the essential monkhood in each of us. But then there are others who are, if you like, the professional monks. They're the full-time committed monks who live in monasteries and do monastic kinds of things. Well, the monastic kinds of things that were going on for Merton in Gethsemane were book writing, because that's what he was exceptional at. Other monks would be involved in agriculture, in cheese making, and all kinds of other things, because they have to keep the monastery going. And of course, they needed to generate the revenue in order to feed the monks, in order to clothe them, even though they dressed simply in their habits. Nonetheless, this monastery grew by the mid-1950s to well over 300, maybe 375 monks. Astonishing. Way more than the number of monks that there were at the monastery when Merton arrived. There was a new abbot, and he was very different from the saintly abbot, Frederick Burton, who was the abbot at the time Merton entered. James Fox was the abbot during most of Merton's monastic career. And James Fox, a Harvard grad, very well connected among the Boston mandarins, a patrician class, interested in business. He didn't go to the Harvard School of Business. He did a degree in history, but he was greatly influenced by the family, had a great business sense, entrepreneurial sense. So he brought that to bear on life in the monastery, and he turned it into an industry. So the monks became laborers, if you like, and they became at one point one of the most important industries in agriculture and in smoking tobacco in the state of Kentucky. And then they started to have to use other people, lay people, farmers in the vicinities and whatnot. I mean, it was a major industry, actually. And it was driving Merton crazy because it was difficult to do the contemplation, to have the silence, to meditate as a monk when you've got all these tractors and machines and construction and noise. So Merton was always trying to find ways of going deeper into the interior life and deeper into the acreage at Gethsemane, because it had a lot of acres, miles of land, and 5 lakes. So it was a pretty hefty place. And Merton eventually succeeded in persuading the monastic authorities to allow him to live as a hermit, but that would come much later in his life. So Merton's job was to write. Merton was so good at this writing, he was responsible for many of these vocations. One of the reasons why so many people were coming into the monastery is because they read Merton's autobiography. Some of you may have read it, or at least have heard of it, called The 7-Story Mountain, which is Dante's description of purgatory. So it's The 7-Story Mountain. Merton wrote this. It was published in 1948. He wrote it as a young man. And it was phenomenally successful. Hundreds of thousands of copies, hardcover, published on the New York Times bestseller list, when that actually meant something, for 6 months. So Merton went from being, this monk who came in from Columbia, much of an orphan, a convert to Catholicism in the 1930s, a man who was thought to have a tremendous literary career down the line, suddenly becomes this celebrity monk, because The 7-Story Mountain is the story of his life. Now, as you know, when you write your autobiography and you're in your early 30s, that means you've got a lot of living left, and that autobiography is going to be revisited a lot of times, and it was. Merton ended up writing his autobiography by expanding it for the rest of his life. In fact, I did a series, television radio series in the United States called The 7-Story Mountain and What Comes After. And it's an effort to explore precisely what did Merton do after you become a huge success as a young man, as a young monk with an autobiography, and you barely lived, right? But from then on in, Merton's celebrity drove success after success after success. And he began to realize, that monasticism, or at least contemplation, I should say, not monasticism so much, is actually a gift for us all. And so he wrote many books about contemplation, seeds of contemplation, revised seeds of contemplation. And of course, perhaps his most famous variation on this, new seeds of contemplation. Some wag once said, well, what about the return of the seeds of contemplation? Well, I suspect if Merton had lived long enough, there would have been many other versions, like one of these endless Marvel comics where you constantly have sequels, right? So Merton's Contemplation book, which was again another bestseller, is a wonderful companion, what we call an encyclopedia, or a handbook of the spiritual life. Something that people use, dip into. Some read sequentially, others read a chapter at a time or dip into it. And it's one of the classics of Merton's spiritual library, but there are many. And Merton not only wrote spiritual books, but he wrote literary ones. He was, in fact, a literature scholar. He was a poet, 10 volumes of poetry. He wrote a novel called My Argument with the Gestapo. He wrote a play called The Tower of Babel, which was performed on radio. He was a notoriously prolific correspondent of Victorian standards, an incredible number of letters that he would write to the famous and the not so famous, the august and the humble. It didn't matter to Merton. He wrote to them all. If somebody wrote to him, he would respond. He had a couple of monks actually whose monastic life was pretty well looking after the boss, carrying up the letters in the morning, carrying back the replies, typing out things for Merton, because Merton became a publishing phenomenon, and not just in the Catholic world. Other works, translations of Gandhi, translations of the Desert Fathers, the extraordinary work that appeared in 1960. Merton was heavily involved in the civil rights movement. In fact, Martin Luther King, who was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, was originally planning to see Merton after his famous speech in Memphis. That was part of the agenda, the itinerary. Merton was very well connected with the African-American struggle for peace and justice. He was also deeply involved in the nuclear disarmament struggles of the early 1960s. He was so active in the peace movement that his French and American Cistercian authorities or Trappist authorities forbade him to write about peace. They told him, you can't publish on peace. So what he did for several years is he Gestetnered. Now, some of you out there might remember what a Gestetner is. It's a very early version of a photocopier with an incredible inky smell. Students would love to be able to go down and get the Gestetner just simply to be able to inhale the fumes. I think it was an early form of intoxication, I don't know. But anyway, Merton and the monks would Gestetner these things, and then they would be sent out like Sabbatsat literature to all kinds of people who would not be identified by name, but only by initials. And they would be among the most famous people in American life, psychiatrists at Harvard, politicians in Congress, other writers and whatnot. So Merton, they're called the Cold War letters. So Merton abided by the in obedience to the instruction that he couldn't publish, but he's thinking to himself, he didn't say I couldn't Gestetner, and I couldn't run these things off and distribute the letters. Eventually, the ban on Merton's writing on peace was lifted. It was a foolish thing to have done in the first place. When it was lifted, of course, there was an outpouring of these writings, and the Cold War letters are available now. One wonders about the fuss, really, because on nuclear armaments and the possibility of nuclear peace, we're still concerned about it. And Merton was on the right side of history. He was often on the right side of history on many points. And of course, he was a great student of the Second Vatican Council, although he entered the monastery long before the council. He was a great student of the council, and he was engaged in what is called ressourcement, going back to the sources. So he went back to the sources, the founders of the Cistercians. The Cistercian order was founded to correct the excesses of Benedictine laxity and impiety and rapacity. And then eventually the Cistercians ended up doing the same kinds of things the Benedictines did. They had big farms, they were major landowners, they had lots of money. The abbots were like minor princes and whatnot. So they had to be reformed. And in the 17th century, there was a French abbot, Armand de Rancé, in the area called La Trappe, and he established the Trappists, who are the Cistercians of the strict observance, meaning that the lax Cistercians or the Cistercians of the common observance, they weren't doing what they should be doing. And so the order was reformed. This is a constant in Catholic Church history, by the way, where orders come, they go, they're reformed, they're abandoned, they're renewed. But it's the cycle of church life. It's the cycle of human life. So anyway, Merton is this famous Trappist monk, known all over the world, read not by thousands, but in fact by millions. His books translated into scores of languages. By the time of his death in 1968, he had published over 50 books. And he only started writing when he was 27, so you can do the math, in addition to countless letters and journals. Now, Merton was not just a controversial monk. He was also, in many ways, an unconventional monk. And he often talked about his life in the most pure and naked of ways. I mean, he, like Pope Francis, he quite easily recognized himself as a sinner, identified himself as a two-way. He saw himself as the holy monk. And so sometimes Catholics are scandalized when they read some of his later journals because they discover things like the fact that he fell in love, had a love affair, and was in a monastery with a nurse who nursed him back from back surgery in 1966 when he was in the hospital. And rather than rejecting all of that and saying it didn't happen, he faced it. He reaffirmed his vows in public. He wrote about it. He wrote about 18 very beautiful love poems. He kept a diary. He did his own analysis of it. It was an important moment in his life, and he wasn't going to discard it. So he was the kind of monk that really just had a voracious appetite for experience. And sometimes he could be imprudent, and sometimes he could be unethical. But the majority of his life was lived within a stern moral compass, because Merton was a man of integrity. He struggled with his vocation, he struggled with his life, he struggled with his loneliness. And perhaps in many ways, that's why people are drawn to him. People still read him. I mean, he's been dead since 1968, and interest in his books has not dropped off. Quite the contrary. Interest in his books continues to rise. And that's very uncommon, that a writer, particularly a spiritual writer, would continue to have that level of interest long after he's died. Of course, we have various examples, Thérèse de Lisieux, Simone Weil, and others. But the sheer range of Merton's genius, the sheer productivity, and the fact that he's quite close to us in time, living in a time of dissolution, when the old structures are beginning to fray, right? But also living in a time of a new awakening. So he's involved in very serious conversation with Zen Buddhists and with Confucianists and with Hindu monks, because he's aware of the centrality, because he's very Christocentric, of Jesus in our lives. But he's never disparaging, never dismissive of the wisdom and the holiness that is to be found in other religious faiths. And he approaches them with humility. So that's Merton, 53 years of age when he dies. He dies in December 10th, same day in the monastery, so many years earlier. He had given a talk on Marxism and monastic perspectives. And he had said at the end of that talk, well, it was time to disappear, because it was quite hot, and so he went off to have a siesta. The reconstruction of events seems to suggest that he took a shower, the soles of his feet were wet, there was a terrazzo floor, there was a short in the plug, and he suffered severe electrocution. He fell, he hit his head, the fan fell on top of him, burned into his chest, and he died. There have been many rumors that have come up. A book that came up about 2 years ago that I had to review, making the argument had earlier been made that he was killed by the CIA, in cahoots with the FBI. This newer book makes the argument that he was killed by some disaffected monks working with right-wing politicians and whatever. So, I mean, conspiracy theories abound. You don't have to live in the Trump era to engage in that level of dangerous fantasy making. But the The fascination with Merton's death continues even to this day, and I suspect it'll never be entirely exercised. But as somebody who spent a great deal of his life, my life, scholarly life, I've written several books on Merton. I've done television and radio series and everything else on Merton. I'm pretty confident that the description of the manner of his death is accurate, or is as close as we're going to get to the truth. But anyway, he died at the age of 53, and I think most of us would recognize that as middle age, right? So where would we be if Merton were around now, if he had had several more years to live, considering the productivity and range and accomplishments by the time he died at the age of 53 in 1968, the year of the assassinations, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and then at the end of that year himself. Very interesting. He was a correspondent with Martin Luther King and a correspondent with some of the Kennedy family, particularly after the death of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. So Merton was a connected kind of dude, as they say, both in the world of political and literary celebrity, but also in the world of spiritual leadership. So that's the background. That's who Thomas Merton was. His name in religion, they all took a name in religion at the time, was Father Louis, because he was a Frenchman. Remember, he was born in France. And so, although he traveled on a British passport, he was actually French, became an American citizen only in the early 1950s, but really was a citizen of the world. He was what we call an extraterritorial figure, both of the mind and of the spirit. And Merton's name in religion, as I said, was Louis, after the only French king ever canonized as Saint Louis of France, Saint Louis de France, Louis IX, King Louis IX. And Merton took the name Louis, and that's that's what they called him. In the monastery, they called him Louis. They never called him Tom or Frater Merton, or they just called him Louis. And it wasn't L-U-I-S. It was the kind of American jazzy Louis, L-O-U-I-E. So in the monastery, he was Father Louis. To many other religious, he was Frater Thomas Merton. To the world, he was Tom Merton. And to many, many, many of his personal friends, some of whom actually sought him out in the monastery. Well, now I'm going to actually give you a little talk here based on an earlier text that I had written that I think would help us understand a little something then about what Merton means when he talks about contemplation and prayer. As you can see by the background and the sheer wealth of material by and about Merton, it's pretty difficult to narrow it down to a couple of things, but I think we can say a few things about contemplation and recollection and prayer that might be helpful for us as we begin our Advent journey. Although in his early life as a monastic, Merton embraced a narrow understanding of the monk's vocation, it never had a complete hold on him. Eventually, after years of meditation and spiritual growth, he came to see the contemplative life, the life of contemplation, as a dependence. This is the first meaning. Dependence on God, a dependence organized in such a way that God is both the nexus and the guiding spirit of the individual's life. It is possible, Merton concluded, to be a contemplative outside the cloister, like ourselves. Here's what Merton says. What is called the contemplative life is really a life arranged in such a way that a person can more easily and more simply and more naturally live in an awareness of direct dependence on God, almost with a sense of realizing consciously at every moment how much we depend on God and receive from God directly everything that comes to us as pure gift, and experience taste in our hearts the love of God in this gift, the delicacy and the personal attention of God to us in God's own merciful love, which Saint Thérèse de Lisieux brought out so beautifully. Now, Saint Thérèse, of course, is the great late 19th century French Carmelite nun. And contemplation for Merton is nothing less than the perfect and ultimate guarantor of human freedom. The free person The genuine contemplative is in harmony with the order of creation. It's tough going now with climate change and all the upheavals, admittedly. Is undeceived by political whim and is alert to the real threats to a civilized society. With his contemporary, the French Catholic existentialist Gabriel Marcel, Merton would agree that and I quote, civilization in which technical progress is tending to emancipate itself more and more from speculative knowledge, and finally to question the traditional rights of speculative knowledge, a civilization which, one may say, finally denies the place of contemplation and shuts out the very possibility of contemplation. Such a civilization, I say, sets us inevitably on the road towards a philosophy which is not so much a love of wisdom as a hatred of wisdom. End of quote. So you see, contemplation is not an activity that is seen largely as passive, decorative, personal and private, a habit, like going out running in the morning or doing exercises or playing cricket or playing bridge. No, contemplation is something rather different than that. It's not a decorative item. It's not a commodity. It's of the essence of who we are. Contemplation, then, Merton argues, is seen as a guarantor of human freedom. And it is not just a metaphysical proposition. It is a political one as well. Indeed, for Merton, contemplation became his only political article of faith. He wasn't a Democrat, he wasn't a Republican. Not an ideologue by temperament, and continually suspicious of all political platforms. Remember, Merton grew up in the war in Europe, World War I. World War II, he was in England, and it is still believed, although there's always some evidentiary issues around this, although we have a legal testament that is true. He had a child when he was in England, when he was an undergraduate, and the mother and the child perished in the Blitzkrieg. That's the 1940 bombing by the German Luftwaffe that came over in droves and almost buried mostly southern England in flame and ruin. It's called the Blitzkrieg. And it is believed, and Merton certainly believed, that he had a child, and the woman by whom he had the child both perished in the flames of the Blitzkrieg. There is some evidence that's true, but there's some evidence that might suggest that it's concoction. But with one is not always entirely sure what is factual and what is a literary device. I think it's fairly reasonable to assume, given the legal attestation and will, that it is most probable that he did father a child. Merton discovered in contemplation the only remaining measure that could secure human freedom in an environment of unsympathetic and destructive forces. Even in the peak years of his political awakening, the 1960s, Merton, the anarchist, the subversive voice of his novel, My Argument with the Gestapo, which was originally titled Journal of My Escape from the Nazis, was never very far away. I should mention something about that novel. It's a kind of a Joycean, Kafkaesque, surreal work. It was called a macaronic journal because it moved among various languages. It's not an easy work to read. I taught it for many years. Nobody ever knew what the hell I was talking about. So I decided, well, maybe it's not the best thing to teach. Maybe I'll try some other work by Burton that's a little more accessible. But the novel is an autobiographical novel. It's not a romantic life, but it's an autobiographical novel. And it's part of it is based on his experience. At one point, he is in Germany, in Koblenz, and he's walking in a field, and Hitler Youth come by in a car and with clenched fists. And he said he experienced the hatred of the Nazis have. And he had another experience when he was on a boat coming to the United States from France, when some of the staff were intimidating the Jewish passengers. So Merton had his own limited, but his own kind of empirical data, if you like, drawn from these brief but insidious experiences with the Nazis. In 1968, Merton would go so far as to argue that the monk, the contemplative par excellence, is engaged in an activity not unlike that of the Marxist revolutionary. You can imagine that certainly set a few bishops on edge. Though he stands in judgment, like the Marxist, on the alienating forces of society, the monk is loath, however, to use those means, guerrilla warfare, kidnapping, sabotage, that are too common a feature of revolutionary resistance. The monk, rather, seeks liberation from the restrictive and archaic strictures of society in order to liberate people from their own self-oppression. As he remarked in his final public address, Marxism and Monastic Perspectives, delivered only hours before his death, as I told you, he says the following: "The monk is a person who has attained, or is about to attain, or seeks to attain, full realization. He dwells in the center of society as one who has attained realization. He knows the score. Not that he has acquired unusual or esoteric information, but he has come to experience the ground of his own being. This is the fruit of contemplation. In such a way that he knows the secret of liberation and can somehow or other communicate this to others." And indeed, although he's not talking about himself, that's exactly what Merton was doing. It is important to note that at the time he spoke the above, he preferred to speak of the contemplative, or the monk, as one who dwelt in the center of society. No longer on the periphery, no longer the sentinel or marginal person, as was the case in the 1940s, 1950s, the contemplative is now the very heart of society as a witness to freedom's possibility. We need our monks. We need our contemplatives. We need to allow our inner monk. We need to allow our inner contemplative to flourish. And not just simply because it gives us a feeling of personal satisfaction, swathes us in certitude, assures us of divine love, but rather because it frees us from the illusions that often encase us. It addresses the residual effects of original sin in our lives, allows us to see ourselves for what we truly are, vulnerable and dependent on God's infinite mercies. It is important also to keep in mind, in Merton's rousing address on the nature and challenges of contemplative life, published a year after his death, that he made clear his conviction that in the end, all the words that are uttered and all the words published on the contemplative life cannot simulate or replicate the unique experience of tasting God's encompassing love. So he said, look, you can write all the books you want about contemplative life, contemplative prayer, the meaning of contemplation. Okay? But that's what he did. That's what he was doing all the time. But he says, you know, really, in the end, it's the unique experience that the individual has, tasting God's encompassing love, that far supersedes all the books, the texts, all the orations, all the notes. He says the contemplative is not the man or woman who has fiery visions of the cherubim carrying God on their imagined chariot, but simply he who has risked his mind in the desert beyond language and beyond ideas, where God is encountered in the nakedness of pure trust. That is to say, in the surrender of our own poverty and incompleteness, in order to no longer clench our minds in a ramp upon themselves, as if thinking made us exist. The message of hope the contemplative offers all of us is not that you need to find your way through the jungle of language and problems that today surround God, but that whether you understand or not, God loves you. God is present to you. God lives in you. God dwells in you. God calls you. God saves you. And God offers you an understanding and delight which are like nothing you have ever found in any book or heard in any sermon. I think we all realize that there's a whole cohort or platoon of snake oil salesmen in the spirituality industry. People will offer you an easy sop, a boon to your prosperous life by making you now spiritual. This is a form of blasphemy. Spirituality is not something you can buy. Contemplation is not something that you can contact Amazon to deliver to your door. It's not something that you pick up after 12 lessons. It's not delivered by a therapist. It's not something that you can organize through a group. It is rather growth in the heart and in the spirit. Contemplation is a life's challenge and work. It's like wisdom. We acquire knowledge and skills, don't we? But to be wise is a different thing. Sometimes we can't describe it, but we know somebody who's wise. We know an elder who carries his or her wisdom lightly, not a pedant, not a scholar making an argument, but somebody with a deep instinctual knowledge about truth and approximating the truth. Very important. And the contemplative is somebody who does that, who lives at a deeper level. But we're all contemplatives. So we're all called to live at a deeper level. I think sometimes what we do is we think, well, those people are contemplatives. Those people are people of prayer. And they're the ones that are the professionals. And we just avail ourselves of their services. So do we go to one of these large churches in the Pentecostal tradition in particular, but other traditions as well that are evangelical or fundamentalist in their leanings. And they have these rousing sermons, and they pass the plate, and they preach a God of heavy judgment, but a God also of infinite love. And they kind of secure you in your understanding of your prosperity and what you've earned and what you can treasure. But those are lies. Those are deceptions. I remember a few years ago, I often called upon to give a couple of talks on Catholic thinkers for the Hayden Institute of Spirituality. This is an institute that was founded in North Carolina by an Episcopalian priest, Anglican here in Canada. And it's world famous now. Oh, I shouldn't say that, but it's continent famous. It's known throughout the United States and Canada. In Canada, the Hayden Institute operates out of Mount Carmel College, which is a Carmelite monastery in Niagara Falls, Ontario. And there are Canadians and Americans that are all part of this. And it's a wonderful way to deepen one's spiritual life. It's the orange juice, one's spiritual life. And one of the things they bring me in for is to talk about Merton and to talk about the Dutch psychologist priest, Henry Nouwen. And I do that. Now, the majority of the people who are part of the Hayden Institute are from different Protestant traditions, United, Methodist, Presbyterian, occasionally Mennonite, Brethren, most predominantly Episcopalian, lots of Episcopalians. So one year, they invited me down to North Carolina to give the talk. It was kind of a scary experience, actually, because I went down there, huge acreage, right near the West Virginia border and the Blue Mountain Ridge. And I remember going there, and you're there for several days, and you live in these huts or fairly luxurious wooden lodge. And there were, I think, about 180 of them, many of them Jungians, followers of Carl Gustav Jung, heavily into dream analysis and interpretation, which I'm not, so I was a bit of an odd one there. But my job was to talk about the two great Catholic pillars of spiritual wisdom of the last century, Merton and Nouwen. And Nouwen actually was a disciple of Merton's. So that was my remit. Anyway, I'm there, and I go out for a walk one evening and come across an exceptionally friendly raccoon, and then an even more friendly skunk. They're rather large, and they're tame, and they tend to follow you around. So the next day I said, the critters here are awfully comfortable walking with their human companions. And they said, oh, yeah, the bears walk right into the cottages. Really, the bears do. And the cougars as well. Well, that's interesting. So I thought, maybe I better check out the reptiles here. So I said, well, what are you on the snake front of things? Oh, well, we're called Snakeland, USA. We have more poisonous snakes than anywhere else in the United States. I said, okay, well, won't be see me so much right now. I'm going to move. Somebody just coughed up something. Anyway, I'm going to move outside of this and just concentrate on other things, which I did, and managed to survive my time with them. But one of the things that came up, which I thought was very interesting, was that the pastor of a large Anglican church in Houston was approached by one of his parishioners who was haunted in his dreams, haunted in his life by a sense of loss. And he worked with him both as a Jungian therapist, but also as an Anglican priest to try to bring him consolation, to get to the depth of his dreams, to try to bring him some liberation, if you like. And so eventually he said to him, well, you keep talking about loss, you're losing your money. Well, how much money do you have? And he said, well, I only have 800 million. And so the pastor said, well, I think we're at the heart of the problem here, that acquiring is not giving you peace. It's compounding your fears. Well, contemplation is like that. It gives us a different kind of peace because it doesn't compound our fears. It addresses our fears that are nurtured by greed, by anxiety over loss, about the determination to be a success in our lives. But what Merton is saying in contemplation is that it's a guarantor of our human freedom. Contemplation is a means or a way of realizing or channeling the infinite liberative mercies of a non-judging God, very different from the kind of God that's sometimes mediated to us by the televangelists. Although true, Merton's love of word making and word declaring in no way subsided during his life. Persuaded that contemplation is not restricted to the professionals, that it is a way of being and a way of seeing. Just think of that. If you're a contemplative and you're into contemplative prayer, it's a way of being and a way of seeing, not just a way of reading. Merton knew that in its advanced stage, contemplative illumination or mystical union, contemplation is profoundly transformative and that we are made anew. Here's a lovely passage in which Merton talks about contemplation and prayer. In William Blake's words, the doors of perception are opened and all life takes on a completely new meaning. The real sense of our own existence, which is normally veiled and distorted by the routine distractions of the alienated life, is now revealed in a central intuition. What was lost and dispersed in the relative meaninglessness and triviality of purposeless behavior, living like a machine, pushed around by impulsions and suggestions from others, is brought together in fully integrated conscious significance. This peculiar, brilliant focus is, according to Christian tradition, it is the work of love, and it is the work of the Holy Spirit. End of quote. Merton was not unaware that the doors of perception to be fully opened for the brilliant focus to be rediscovered, some fundamental truths about our human condition need to be remembered, that the contemplative quest for integration is a life project and not a passing fancy, and that the dialect played out between the true self and the false self requires discipline, discernment, and detachment. The false self, Merton understands to be all that which is illusory, self-inflating, distancing from grace, sealed from the rays of liberation. We're all like that, or at least I am, caught up in our own self-congratulatory ways, convinced of our own righteousness, comfortable in our own superiority. But that's the false self. The true self, Merton says, is our entire substantial reality itself, on its highest and most personal and most existential level. It is like life, and it is life. It is our spiritual life, our life of prayer, when it is most active. It is the life by which everything else in us lives and moves. It is in and through and beyond everything that we are. If it is awakened, it communicates a new life to the intelligence in which it lives, so that it becomes a living awareness of itself. End of quote. So contemplation, then, to wrap up, is at the heart of the making of the fully human. You want to be fully human? Do you want to be, as St. Irenaeus says, a person fully alive? Then you become a contemplative. Contemplation brings the subject into a rare intimacy with the transcendent. Contemplation allows for the casting off of the shackles of self-delusion, and contemplation ensures our true freedom in Christ. Thomas Merton's understanding of contemplation and prayer was sophisticated. It was highly nuanced. It was historically flavored, and it was spiritually expansive. And his appreciation of the role of prophecy combined to guarantee his continued reputation as a monk open to the world, a critic of Catholicism's institutional inadequacy, and an astute and rigorous judge of the world's political, social, and philosophical pathologies of the spirit. Well, if Merton was saying that in the 1960s, I think you can appreciate that we have a great deal to worry about these pathologies of the spirit in the Trumpian era. In the words of his former student and fellow monk, the psychiatrist, Abbot John Ouds Bamberger, Merton presented contemplation, and here's what the abbot psychiatrist said, as the activity of a person who becomes whole in his humanity through seeking intimate union with God. Merton thus gave a fresh life to the word contemplation and to the ideal of a contemplative life that continues to speak to the minds and hearts of Cistercian monks today, and which has a broad appeal to persons living in our modern world. Yes, and that includes us, living in Vancouver, British Columbia. That's Merton's message to us in our time. Okay, I would be happy to respond to any questions, concerns, spasms of outrage, or whatever. Now, am I to go to the question and answer or the chat, or what's the best way to work this, Angela Marie?
We can do it together. I could probably look at the questions and then pass them along to you, Dr. Higgins. One first question that came in says, please describe the difference between contemplation and meditation.
Well, that's a good question. And often it does require a distinction. Meditation is a form of concentrated recollection, whereas contemplation is a kind of interior pathway. Sometimes the words are used interchangeably. Contemplative may sometimes be someone who meditates as well, right? But meditation can sometimes have a more secular meaning, whereas contemplation has a more distinctly theological nuance. Contemplation is a form of dialogue with God, and it's a portal, an entry point in which we enter into, by which we enter into the interior life. Contemplation is a form of enrichment. It's a form of making us free. It's a form of conforming us to Jesus. Meditation is again focused concentration. Meditation is a very good thing, and of course Christian meditation, especially in the worldwide Christian meditation movement founded by John Main and now made famous with Lawrence Freeman, deals very much with meditation in the tradition of John Cassian, and it's a form of emptying the mind, using the mantra to bring us into a deeper silence, into a deeper rhythm. And meditation in that context has a strong physiological and psychological component, as well as a way into a deepening of the spiritual life. Contemplation is a more intellectualized, but at the same time also affective, meaning dealing with the emotions, way of entry into a deeper knowledge and deeper connection with Christ in the Christian tradition. I probably made that more complicated now than it probably was originally, but there you have it.
No, thank you, Dr. Higgins. Would you say that contemplation is given by God?
Well, God gives us everything. All life is a gift, of course. And contemplation is, as I said earlier, kind of addresses the quintessential monkhood that's in all of us. Like, I think we're all called to be contemplatives in a modest way, right? And we don't think of ourselves as contemplative. We think, well, monks and nuns who are cloistered, they're contemplative. We live in the world, they live outside the world and whatnot, but that's a facile distinction. Very often we carry our own inner contemplative needs with us, and they need to be addressed like everything else. You know that we address our inadequacies in our physical and psychological lives by going to specialists that can help us, or by reading books that help to inform us about what we're like physically and psychologically. The same exists with our spiritual lives, right? So we turn to the masters and the mistresses of great spiritual meaning, Teresa of Avila, Thérèse de Lisieux, Julian of Norwich, among women, and there are many, many more, of course. And then you think of the male saints like John of the Cross, just one example of saints whose lives were contemplative lives. They looked for a greater and more intense encounter with Christ through the mode of contemplation. But that's not exclusive to them. Merton makes his case in Seeds of Contemplation and New Seeds of Contemplation that we're all quite capable of being contemplatives in our own special way. Now, if you're a mother and your father, you have several children, you need to make an income in order to keep the family alive, you're probably thinking, well, when do I ever find contemplative time? Well, we have to make contemplative time in the same way that we make time for other things that matter to us aesthetically. So we go to concerts, or we go to galleries or something like this, or we go to films that we really like. Well, the spirit needs to be nurtured as well. It needs to be fed. And that's one of the things you're doing by participating in this forum tonight. You're feeding the spirit. This is a way of deepening your understanding of your faith and of your spiritual lives. So it's not contemplation in and of itself, but it's a reflection on contemplation. But is contemplation a gift? Yes, it is a gift to us all. It's a universal gift. Some of us will become, quotation marks, full-time contemplatives. That's a uniquely vocational gift. But in the sense that we all can contemplate, that's a universal gift.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Higgins. How does Ignatius' contemplation, putting oneself into scripture, fits with the description that you have just given about the contemplative life according to Merton?
Well, Merton was certainly very interested in the Ignatian approach, and the Ignatian approach, of course, is very much to visualize a particular scene, right, in the exercises. It's the compositio loci, it's called, in which you put yourself in the picture, right? And it's a wonderful way of bringing you into a deeper connection with prayer and with the life and narrative of Jesus. Merton was drawn to Jesuit spirituality, though he was not a Jesuit. It's very interesting that he was working on his doctorate on Gerard Manley Hopkins, the great Jesuit poet, when he decided to become a monk. And, well, first of all, he decided to become a Roman Catholic and then moved on later into the religious life. But he was working on Gerard Manley Hopkins at the time. And remember, Hopkins was converted by Newman. So there's always this lovely connection between great religious figures, that each one reads the other and is deeply influenced by the other. So Merton was interested in Ignatian spirituality, but it was not his tradition. His tradition was Cistercian. It was the tradition of the spirituality of the Desert Fathers. So he was both eremitical as well as cenobitic, that is, a hermit-like as well as community-focused. He did try his hand at Franciscan spirituality, we know that. For he wasn't as successful as Sister Angela Marie, but he gave it a try. And then the Jesuit, great interest in Jesuit spirituality, but he was not Jesuit. And in the end, Ignatian spirituality had meaning for him, but it wasn't his prayer modality. But a good question, though.
Thank you, Dr. Higgins. And for someone who has never read anything from Thomas Merton, which one is the best book to begin with and why?
Oh, that's a very good question. I love that question. It comes up all the time, and it's a good question, especially when you have 50 books. You say, okay, how do I even approach this guy? Okay, so you have to forgive me. This will be a moment of shameless self-marketing. But the best way to get into Merton is to read one of my books, okay? And the reason for that is it gives you an entree to this life, and then you can look at the bibliography at the back and decide what you want. There are two books, one called The Unquiet Monk, published by Orbis Books in the States and Novalis in Canada, and the other one called Thomas Merton, Faithful Visionary, published by Liturgical Press in the States and Novalis in Canada. That's Faithful Visionary and The Unquiet Monk. And what they will do is they'll bring you into a deeper appreciation and understanding of Merton and all his works. And then you can say, okay, well, I'm interested in Merton the writer, or I'm interested in Merton the diarist, or I'm interested in Merton the contemplative, or I'm interested in Merton the scholar who went into the ancient historical sources to really understand the roots of monasticism, or I'm interested in Merton in his conversations with the great non-Catholic, non-Christian figures of our time, people like Chakravarti, Suzuki, and others. Like, many people come at Merton by various and diverse routes. I remember years ago, in 1973, I think it was, I began my own work on Merton just a couple of years after he died. So I'm considered one of the first generation of Merton scholars. So I've been around for a long time. I've written several books on Merton, but I was starting to work on Merton just within 5 years of his death. 4 years of his death, right? And so many of his friends and the abbot and the prior and everybody was still around, and I would go to the monastery, and this was before they moved all the archives to Balmain University, and I would be working with that and trying to find my way around. And I remember thinking that one time I was giving a talk in Toronto, I think at the University of Toronto, somebody came up to me and said, I hear you like Merton. I said, well, yes, I do. He said, when did you take up photography? I said, what? And he said, well, isn't he a famous photographer? I said, well, yes, later in his life, he was well known as a photographer, but you know, he was a monk and a poet. This person was completely surprised by that. And you often find people come to Merton with a different perspective, or having read a particular book or something, they think, that's Merton, that's what Merton's like. Well, Merton can't be caged in. And what is helpful in getting an introduction to Merton, you don't have to read my books, of course, obviously, but an introduction to Merton is that it can identify those particular aspects of Merton's writing that appeal to you, because you may not be interested in Merton's writing about pre-Christian Confucian symbols, but you are deeply interested in what Merton has to say about social justice in Harlem in the 1930s. So people come at Merton from different angles. Sometimes people say, well, read the classic autobiography, Seven Storey Mountain. Yes, but it's a very dated work. 1948, a young man, he had to spend the rest of his life rewriting his autobiography. It's a curse to write your autobiography when you're young. Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton wrote his autobiography at a perfect time. He wrote the autobiography just before he published it, he died. Well, that's perfect. That's the last chapter. Nobody has to add anything. It's excellent timing. But if you write your autobiography and you're just beginning to live, well, you know, there's going to be a fair bit of revisioning here, because if you're a deep, reflective, growing human being, you're going to change over the next number of decades, right? And so I would suggest, again, just getting an introductory book on Merton and his life, and then saying, okay, here are the things that I really want to explore. And both of these books give you a nice bibliography at the back, would help direct you towards aspects of Merton's life that would interest you. Okay. Sorry for the marketing moment, but
oh, no wonders. This is wonderful. Thank you so much. We actually are recording this session. We will send the recording, and we can add the links to the two books that you have suggested.
Thank you.
So for the people to look at it. Some of you have asked for the prayer, so we will add the prayer that we began to into the follow-up email. Another question asks about Merton's criticism of Anglicanism and Protestantism. Has that changed? Did it change over his lifetime since he wrote The Seven-Storey Mountain?
It most certainly did. He was highly critical of Anglicanism. And part of that was the result of his experience in an Anglican private school in England, public school, we call them in England. Similarly, had experience with a public school in France, which was even more ruthless and punishing. And he could be quite dismissive, cryptic about Anglican clerics and Anglicans. By about the 1950s, by the time I get to Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, which is a journal, comes out in 1956, it covers about a number of years. It's a beautiful book, actually. But it goes from 1956 to 1964, actually. Those are the years. And he begins to readdress this issue of his unkind and errant distaste for Anglicanism, and begins to probe deeper into Anglican spiritual life, the poetry of R.S. Thomas. He befriends a canon, Donald Alchin, who's an expert on Anglican and Orthodox spirituality, Romanian spirituality. He takes up the writings of Christopher Smart, the mystic. He looks at the great Anglican divines of the early 17th century, people like John Donne and George Herbert and Henry Vaughan and Thomas Traherne and the great Anglican divines and poets. So Merton began to correct the poor apprehension, the poor understanding he had of Anglicanism, and it's interesting because many of the finest scholarship. Much of the finest scholarship on Merton has ever been done has been done by Anglicans. And so Merton has always enjoyed a kind of prominence within the Anglican world, even as in his early years he was fairly dismissive of it. So he certainly changed very much. And there was Anglican roots in his own family. As I said, his father was Anglican, and his few relatives that he had lived in New Zealand and in Australia. And I think they were also in Wales at one point, tracing his lineage or his roots. We find that they're Anglican and Methodist, and of course Methodism comes from Anglicanism. So that he made peace with his early easy judgments and began to appreciate the deeper strains and the beauty of Anglican thought and Anglican spirituality. But a very good question, because that was one of many turns in Merton's life when he was all fiery and condemnatory. And the next thing you know, he's thinking, oh my God, I got that wrong. Merton could suffer from an excessive zeal and self-righteousness. And he was all puffed up sometimes with triumphalism. His genius lies also in his humility when he comes to think, oh my God, was I like that? When they published the Japanese edition of The Seven-Storey Mountain, in the preface, he said, I don't want to be known as the Seven-Storey Mountain Man. That's not me anymore. But that had become him. He was the Seven-Storey Mountain Man because that early book was such a stunning success that it defined him. We have incredible examples of people coming back from the Second World War who had come back from the Second World. They were GIs and they were retired, or they were deeply despondent over the carnage in Europe and what they're looking for meaning in their lives. They read the Seven-Storey Mountain, so they're all coming into the monasteries. This was an incredible period of growth in the United States and in other places across the world, including Canada. And many of these young men coming in as novices or postulants into the monastery came because they read Merton. Merton was the greatest vocation director in the history of monasticism, and he never intended that to be the case. He was master of scholastics for about 5 years, and he was master of novices for 10 years.
And Dr. Higgins, one of our attendees says that Merton commented on a small book entitled Arrow of Flame. And in this book, it talks about how to become one with God. But she says, I've never found any commentary on this. Do you know of any?
I've never heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
No, I've never heard of that.
Okay.
But I spent, since 1973 on Merton. So you may have unearthed something nobody else knows about. So hold on to that. Hold on to that. But I'm not familiar with that at all.
Very good. Well, thank you.
Okay.
And then, well, there's still several questions about contemplation in general. How do we even start? Where can we start in our very, very busy world? What are some practical ways in which we can begin to contemplate? What kind of prayers are part of contemplation? So maybe if we can give a little help to our attendees.
Well, you know, that's a very good question because it is tough to get started, right? And I always recommend to people that you get one of Merton's books, something like No Man is an Island, which is a series of reflections, or what I had mentioned several times before, New Seeds of Contemplation. That's a beautiful book. It's got something like 35 chapters in it, right? And they're very short chapters. And if you read one chapter a night or one chapter a week and reflected on it, that would start you on the road to a kind of, if only partial, discipline in contemplation, because contemplation does call for discipline, right? Serious prayer is discipline. It's setting up a time, it's making a commitment. Usually you have a space where you do your praying, right? It's a very important in the Ignatian tradition, right? And in the Benedictine, you would pray the office, or you reflect on the readings of the day. In the case of Merton, of course, Merton was a monk, so he would be praying the choral offices, right? Starting with matins and then lauds and prime and none and sext and terce and vespers and compline. Like, he would go through all the hours and they would sing them. And I don't know if you've ever had the chance to be in a Cistercian monastery or a Benedictine monastery that uses the Salem tradition, Saint-Pierre de Salem, which is the great Benedictine monastery in France. The music is magnificent beyond compare. I mean, it will just carry you by its beauty, its sublimity, actually. And this you could see in the monastery in Gethsemane as well, that the prayer, the singing, just lifts you beautifully out of yourselves. Merton was very much what we would call a progressive. I mean, his theological thinking was certainly much to the left of many of his religious companions. But on other things, he was an organic intellectual and spiritual conservative. He preferred to say the office in Latin, okay, because he preferred its purity and its beauty over what he thought were cumbersome English translations. And he was a poet, and he actually wrote some poetry in Latin. He wrote poetry in French. He translated from Spanish and Portuguese poetry. He was a polyglot. He spoke several languages. He managed to situate himself imaginatively and spiritually in the lives of some of the great spiritual figures, right? And that form of imaginative engagement, which is a bit Ignatian, if you like, that form of imaginative engagement is a wonderful example of Merton's voracious openness, his expansiveness of spirit, listening to other traditions, listening to other religious figures, Christian and non-Christian, and not seeing them as fearful. He didn't think, well, I'm going to enter into dialogue with this famous Zen Buddhist monk, and by the end of the conversation, I'll be a Zen Buddhist. No. Nor was he out to convert people. He was out to understand and to grow in dialogue. And I think those aspects of Merton's life have a particular resonance in our own time, right? With so much religious misunderstanding, fear and divisiveness. Merton is an inspiring figure that way. I think we got about only 8 minutes left here, right, sister? Right. I'm beginning to lose my voice now, yeah.
I know, maybe I will ask you one last question that is personal, and then we'll conclude with some upcoming events. What impressed you the most about Merton's writing on contemplation on a personal level?
His honesty.
Mm-hmm.
Merton sometimes could be laceratingly honest. He addressed his own vulnerabilities, and because he did that, he allows people to feel comfortable in his presence. There is nothing artificial about his thinking or his spirituality. It's sometimes raw, often beautiful, sometimes mystical, but it's always connected. And it's troubled too. Merton's wasn't an easy life. He was a complex figure, as men and women of genius invariably are, right? So if you're looking for a plastic saint, this isn't going to work, right? So Merton he's devilishly difficult to contain, but he is for many people he's a vehicle to grace, and I encourage you to dip into Merton. I'm sure that he'll speak to your heart.
Thank you very much, Dr. Higgins, for being with us tonight and for returning to Into the Deep. We hope that you will return again and share with us more of your beautiful knowledge. And we will send out the recording to this presentation along with your own books and the books that you have suggested. So thank you for all of you for attending tonight. And coming up in the next few weeks, we're entering the season of Advent, and here are some wonderful opportunities for you to continue to grow in prayer and contemplation and to learn more about our faith. We will begin a novena to St. Joseph on November 30th that will lead to the consecration of St. Joseph on December 8th on the feast of the solemnity of the Annunciation on December 8th for the closing of the year of St. Joseph. Along with the novena, and in between the novena, actually, we'll have the great joy of welcoming virtually live from Rome, Cardinal Antonio Luis Tagle, who will speak about walking with St. Joseph during the Advent season. And then again, the Mass for the closing of the year of St. Joseph on December 8th at 5:10 p.m. Please join us. And if you're not able to, the Mass will be live streamed and we will all make the consecration together on that night. And then our own annual Advent retreat on December 3rd. So a week from today, next Friday, we will have Father Boniface Hicks, a Benedictine monk from the United States, Pennsylvania, St. Vincent Seminary, and our own Vancouverite, Father Aldaba. He's part of the Norbertine community in California, St. Michael's Abbey. So we're very excited to have these two wonderful young priests, very energetic, very spiritual, to lead us in our Advent retreat. And our next Into the Deep session will be with Dr. Scott Helfinger, and he is a professor with the Augustine Institute, and he will deliver a lecture on building the stable just right before Christmas. So again, thank you for being with us tonight, and thank you to Dr. Higgins. Blessings on your Advent journey, and we will see each other again soon. God bless you, and thank you, Dr. Higgins.
My pleasure. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.